A voice speaks from beyond the grave. Can reason untangle the impossible? Welcome to Eco Mysteriosa. I am your host, Urvela. Tell me where you're watching from in the comments. Your words make this journey unforgettable. Now, let's begin. It was upon an evening of remarkable clearness for that fog-laden season that Inspector Lestrade was shown into our modest sitting-room at Baker Street. The gas lamps along the Marylebone Road burned with an almost indecent steadiness, and even the incessant rattle of hansoms seemed chastened, as though London herself were holding her breath. My companion, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, had contrived to balance his violin upon the arm of his chair, and was engaged in that curious ritual of his, half reverie, half experiment, where he would pluck a single string to produce a whisper of tone, then fall into a silence more eloquent than speech. Lestrade, with the air of a man who had come to the last thin plank of his professional resources, stood upon the hearthrug and worried his hat between his palms. "I trust I do not interrupt," he began. "You have already interrupted twice, Inspector," said Holmes without looking round. "Once upon the doorstep, when you shifted your weight from the hall tiles to the wool runner. Your boots speak of damp clay from the embankment, and again when you paused in the passage to read Mrs. Hudson's small placard forbidding tobacco ash in the corridor. Pray be seated. You are not a man to come empty-handed at this hour." Lestrade's small eyes flicked about the room. "How the deuce you knew I had been near the river?" "Because," Holmes remarked, rising at last to poke the fire, "you carry upon your left cuff a minute varnish of Thames ooze, note the faint green, picked up as you steadied yourself against a painted mooring post, and this sable streak upon your boot is not soot, but the crushed wing of a river gnat, by which I date your visit to within the last hour, for they are troublesome round the lamps at the water's edge when the evening turns warm. But you have not come, I think, to discuss entomology." I could not suppress a smile at the familiar interplay, though Lestrade's expression remained dour. He set his hat upon his knee and leaned forward. "Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said, "I have a case that will make your hair stand on end if you can make head or tail of it. A gentleman spoke after death, spoke plain and unmistakable, and 5 people heard him." Holmes's eyes, which a moment before had been drowsy, brightened as a spark leaps from tinder. "After death," he repeated gently. "Come, Inspector, you know I have no taste for fairy tales. Lay the facts." Lestrade drew from his inner pocket a folded sheet and a small envelope. He placed them upon our table with a care one reserves for fragile curiosities. "The deceased," he began, "is Mr. Alistair Farnham Penrith, a shipping magnate of Threadneedle Street, lately retired. His house stands in Queen Anne's Gate, with the usual provision of servants and a niece who keeps the household. The time of death is certified between 10:40 and 10:50 this evening, by Dr. Percival Gale, a reputable man and the family surgeon for 20 years. Cause strangulation. Manual?" asked Holmes sharply. "So it appears. There are marks upon the throat, thumbs on the left, fingers on the right. But that is the least part of it. Half an hour after the doctor's examination, at precisely 11:16 by the hall clock, Mr. Penrith's voice was heard speaking from within his locked study. 'Burn the green ledger,' he says, as clear as I'm talking to you. 'Burn it, do you hear? It concerns the Heron Line. Burn it at once.' Those were the words, and you may write them down, Dr. Watson, for we shall have to be exact. It was heard by 5. I asked pen in hand. The niece, Miss Lydia Penrith, the butler, a footman, the housekeeper, and Dr. Gale. They were in the corridor outside the study. The door was bolted from within, the shutters latched, and the key was found in the man's pocket when we forced entry. There is no second door, no speaking tube, no contrivance that we can discover." Holmes turned the envelope with a long forefinger, his head bent, his face composed and curiously absent. "And what is this?" "A fragment," Lestrade said. "We found it on the hearthrug near the writing table. Looks to me like a splinter of wax, brownish, ridged. Dr. Gale says it might be sealing wax. I say it is the devil's own plaything. And this," he tapped the folded sheet, "is a list of the articles in the study as witnessed by our men." Holmes opened the paper with a crisp sound. As he read, his brow acquired those minute horizontal lines which to me always advertised his interest. "Papers on the desk," he murmured. "Steel fireproof safe, open. Ashes in grate. Greenish tint observed. Edison phonograph upon the side table. Ah, cylinder case empty. Broken shreds of wax upon the rug. A single candlestick guttered to the pan. Clock on mantel stopped at 10:47. A smear of some oil upon the window latch. Faint odour of carbolic in the air. Your list is better than most, Lestrade." "You are learning the phonograph," I exclaimed. "Holmes, if a cylinder had been set to play—" "You are thinking what I am," Holmes said, and there was that dry curl at the edge of his lip which I had learned to fear on behalf of criminals. "A man may speak when he is miles away, if Edison will lend him his tongue." Lestrade spread his hands. "We thought of that, only there is no cylinder to be found. The case was empty, and the bits on the rug are too small to read." Holmes lifted his head. "To read?" Lestrade shrugged. "My word for it. I have seen Mr. Edison's cylinders, like a string of ants frozen in wax. These were crumbs. Besides, Dr. Gale swears the voice was not metallic or far off, as in a machine, but natural, close as a man at your elbow." "A doctor's ear is not easily deceived," Holmes murmured. "And yet, what of the safe?" "Open, as I say," Lestrade replied. "Miss Penrith states her uncle had lately become protective of certain books, ledgers of the Heron Line, the shipping company he chaired before he retired. She has not seen them, though she handled his accounts. The servants say he kept a green-covered ledger in the inner shelf. There is no sign of it now, only a smear of green upon the ash in the grate." Holmes lifted the envelope again and allowed the splinter of wax to slide onto his palm. He sniffed it delicately, then touched it with the tip of his tongue, in a manner which drew a protest from me. "Holmes!" "Bah, Watson! The dust of London is more poisonous. This is not sealing wax, but a brittle residue of hard brown composition used for phonograph cylinders. Note the faint sweetness of stearine. Crushed by a heel, I should judge, and recently. Inspector, you have either a talking dead man or a speaking machine murdered to silence it. You will see the dilemma. We saw it, and we are stuck with it," Lestrade said grimly. "The family and the doctor swear the voice was natural. The door was bolted, and the niece swears her uncle would never have had truck with spiritualists or such conjuring. He was a practical man." Holmes tapped the shard upon the table so that it made a tiny, brittle music. "And the windows?" "Latched. There is a smear of oil on one latch, as your clever eye noticed. No footprints on the balcony. The stone is dry and the night fine. The inner bolt of the door was shot. We had to force it." "Excellent," said Holmes, and to my astonishment he smiled. "This grows pleasing. The world's dullness weighs on me, Lestrade, and you have brought a draught of tonic. Watson, your hat. We shall go at once." "At once!" I cried. "It is past midnight. That is the best of times for visiting the dead," he returned. "Besides," here he cast a glance, keen and intimate, at Lestrade's cuff. "Our inspector has the merest trace of brass polish upon his sleeve, acquired not from a mooring post, but from a polished door plate with a letter cut in it, an A, if I do not mistake, and there is no brass upon our own door or Mrs. Hudson's. You stopped, Lestrade, at a certain address before you came to us, seeking counsel you would not take. Queen Anne's Gate is not far from here. You have a cab." Lestrade stared, coloured, and rose. "By the Lord, Holmes, you are a magician. Holmes, you are a magician. Holmes, nothing of the sort. You must keep your sleeves out of other men's polish. Come." We were soon rattling through the comparative hush of the Westminster streets, the cab's lamps throwing a shifting fan of light upon the gleam of railings and the pale blocks of stone facades. Holmes sat forward with his chin in his hand, and once, without moving his eyes from the window, he spoke in that dreamy tone which yet carries the precise ring of a file upon metal. "A man speaks after death, Watson. One word and the world shudders. But there are only 3 ways in which a dead man can speak. He can prearrange his utterance, he can be impersonated, or he can be misheard. Let us see which ghost walks in Queen Anne's Gate." We drew up before a handsome, sober house, whose brass plate, clean enough to shave in, did indeed bear the initial A among other letters, A. F. Penrith. The street was quiet, only the distant tramp of a constable, and the far-off shiver of a late train signalled the city's ceaseless motion. Lestrade led us into a hall of fanlights and polished wood, where a tall, composed young woman awaited us, the pallor of recent shock still upon her features. She was of that steadfast type I have sometimes observed among ladies who keep a house in order despite a man's storms. Grey eyes direct, mouth firm yet gentle. "Miss Penrith," Lestrade said, "this is Mr. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson." She inclined her head. "I have heard of you, Mr. Holmes. If, as Inspector Lestrade says, you can make sense of what we heard—" Her voice faltered. "You shall have every assistance." Holmes bowed with that grave courtesy which he could summon upon rare occasions, and which never failed to reassure women in distress. "You heard your uncle's voice, Miss Penrith?" "I did," she said. "We all did. Dr. Gale had just told us, that my uncle was gone. We were in the passage. Then, from the study, we heard him speak, just as he would lean in the doorway and call to the housekeeper, 'Burn the green ledger. Burn it. It concerns the Heron Line. Burn it at once.' I confess I cried out and would have gone to him, but the door would not open. Inspector Lestrade came soon after, and—" She pressed the handkerchief to her lips. "You know the rest." Holmes's face, which had softened, resumed its hawk-like aspect. "Your uncle's affairs, were they in confusion?" She hesitated. He was troubled of late. He had retired from the company, yet ships still put in under his name, and there were rumours of irregularities. He received letters he locked away. Twice this week I heard him speak of a ledger in the safe, and yesterday he charged me, if anything befell him, to send for Dr. Gale, and to admit no visitors until the morning." "Visitors?" Holmes repeated. "He expected some. I cannot say. Only—" She glanced towards the staircase and lowered her voice. "He had quarrelled with my cousin, his sister's son, Mr. Julian Vale. My uncle had paid his debts more than once. Mr. Vale came this afternoon. There were angry words. My uncle forbade him the house. That is all I know. Your cousin's address. Rooms in Jermyn Street." Holmes nodded as if adding a bead to some invisible abacus. "We shall presently ask Mr. Vale to account for his evening. In the meantime, you will forgive us if we view the study." She led the way along the corridor, Lestrade at her side. Holmes, drifting a step behind, lifted a finger to the hall clock. 11:16, he murmured, more to himself than to us. "So exact a time mark is a boon to the police and to the guilty." The study was an orderly, Masculine apartment, mahogany, leather, a globe. The sober ranks of ledgers and law books that signal a life of mercantile responsibility. Upon the rug, as Lestrade had said, lay a few brown crumbs no larger than grains of cracked wheat. The phonograph stood with its horn tilted like a listening ear toward the writing table. In the grate smouldered a residue of ash that even in the dim light showed a curious greenish cast, like seawater seen through glass. On the mantel, the small French clock had indeed come to grief, and pointed perpetually to 10 minutes to 11, its spring run down, or its works arrested. Holmes moved through the room, as a bee visits each flower in turn. With a sort of intent playfulness, he examined the door-bolt and latch, sniffed the air above the grate, and glanced sharply at the window catch, where a tiny crescent of oil glimmered. "Watson," he said softly. "Your nose, if you please." I bent as he indicated. The air above the ash carried an acrid sweetness, not unlike the hospital disinfectants with which I was only too familiar. "Carbolic," I said, "and something else, faint. What is it?" Holmes's nostrils dilated. "Sea salt? No, a preservative. Glycerin, perhaps." He straightened, lifted the phonograph's lid, and regarded the empty cylinder mandrel. With a magnifying lens drawn from his pocket, he surveyed the rug, then knelt where the crumbs lay, selecting one with a penknife and slipping it into his pocketbook. "Inspector," he said at length, "have any of your men a talent for music?" Lestrade blinked. "Music? No, a pity. The deaf, I have observed, are better policemen than the merely inattentive, for they must learn to see what others hear. Never mind. We shall find our music elsewhere." He turned at the hearth, where the greenish ash glowed like the dying eye of a serpent. "Do not permit anyone to touch this grate," he added with sudden sharpness. "It may contain a word the dead wish to destroy." "And you think the voice—" Lestrade began. Holmes looked at him with a calm that was almost pitying. "The dead may speak no more than the living can be silent. We shall discover presently who taught Mr. Penrith his final sentence." He lifted the candlestick, held it to the light, and with the same motion passed the flame beneath the window latch. A nearly invisible sheen stirred and ran. "Ah!" he murmured, and for the first time since we had entered the house, his eyes flashed. "Watson, Lestrade, do you not see? Not yet. Then do me the kindness of not seeing a little longer. Let us call upon Dr. Gale. After that, perhaps upon Mr. Julian Vale." Miss Penrith, who had watched with a desperate composure, clasped her hands. "Mr. Holmes, tell me only, is it a trick? Did someone make my uncle speak?" Holmes's voice, when it came, was very gentle. "My dear Miss Penrith, in all London there are perhaps 3 men who can make a dead man speak. 2 of them are charlatans, and the 3rd is a genius. We must learn which one visited Queen Anne's Gate tonight." Dr. Gale received us in the withdrawing room, a tall and spare man with a trim beard, and the brisk manner of one accustomed to have his word taken without question. He bowed to Miss Penrith and gave Holmes a look in which curiosity and faint irritation were curiously mingled. "You come late, gentlemen," he said. "The patient, if one may still call him that, was beyond all aid 2 hours ago." "Yet not beyond speech, so I understand," Holmes replied with an air of languid courtesy. "You were among those who heard the words." The doctor's lips tightened. "I did, and I shall maintain their reality against all quibbling. The voice was Alistair Penrith's, as plain as yours is now, Mr. Holmes. He was a man I had known 30 years. I could not mistake it. The timbre, the inflection, even the slight burr upon the R. No phonograph could contrive such a thing. Holmes leaned against the mantel and regarded him with half-closed eyes. "Then you place yourself in the camp of the supernaturalists, Doctor? You are willing to believe that the human throat, once stilled, may resume its labour without lungs, windpipe or breath?" Gale flushed but stood firm. "I do not profess to explain it. I tell you only what I heard. It may be that shock deceived me, but I do not think so. I was calm, for I had but a moment earlier made out the certificate of death." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "At what hour precisely did you sign?" 10:54. 10:54. "And you are certain that the cessation of the heart was complete? No flutter, no faint impulse?" "None. I have practiced medicine 20 years. The man was as surely dead as this coal is cold." Holmes accepted the words with a slight bow, but I could see by the gleam in his eye that the contradiction delighted him. He began to pace the carpet slowly, hands clasped behind his back. "You will indulge me one question more, Doctor. When the words were heard, did you note aught in the atmosphere? Any echo, mechanical vibration, or reverberation?" Gale shook his head impatiently. It was as if the man stood within the study and called out. There was no distortion, no metallic echo. I say again, it was natural. Holmes let the matter drop and turned to Miss Penrith. "Your cousin, Mr. Julian Vale. He was present in the house when this phenomenon occurred." She hesitated. "No, he had quitted the place hours earlier. I have not seen him since their quarrel. My uncle forbade him entry. But," she faltered, "I cannot say with certainty that he did not return." Holmes's keen glance flickered towards the inspector. "Lestrade, you will procure an account of Mr. Vale's movements from the hour of 9 until now. Make it thorough. I have known young gentlemen of Jermyn Street to find their alibis in questionable haunts." Lestrade grunted assent and withdrew to confer with his sergeant in the hall. Holmes, meanwhile, bent to the phonograph, scrutinizing its horn and fittings with minute attention. "Watson," he said softly, "observe the faint film about the mouth of the horn. Grease, not dust. Fresh. Some cylinder has been handled here within the last hour, despite the emptiness of the case." He plucked a small thread from the catch and held it up to the lamplight. "And this, what would you call it?" I examined it. "A fibre, silk perhaps. Green?" "Green," he echoed, slipping it carefully into his pocket-book beside the crumb of wax. "A hue to match the ledger, is it not? Now why should ledger and fibre both vanish in flame, while a few reluctant shreds linger? There is economy in destruction, Watson, but also impatience. We have a hand that is thorough in purpose, yet hasty in execution." Miss Penrith looked from one to the other, bewildered. Holmes regarded her with sudden gentleness. "You must forgive us, madam. Truth, like a lantern, shows first the dust in the air, before it reaches the figure in the dark. I beg you will retire. The inspector will guard the house. Dr. Watson and I have business with the night." When she had gone, Holmes whispered swiftly, "We are upon the edge of the true trail. The voice was not a ghost's, but a plan. Someone, fearing discovery of that ledger, contrived the illusion of speech to secure its destruction. But how? By whose hand? We shall know before dawn. Come, Watson, Jermyn Street waits for us, and a cousin whose debts may speak louder than his conscience." The streets lay in uneasy quiet as we made our way toward Jermyn Street, the clatter of our cab's wheels softened by the late hour. Holmes sat hunched in thought, his gaze fixed upon some invisible point far beyond the rattling pane, his fingers pressed together beneath his chin in that posture which I had come to associate with his most penetrating meditations. I had long since learned the futility of disturbing him at such moments. But the puzzle of a dead man's voice gnawed at my own mind with restless insistence. It was past 1 in the morning when we drew up before a handsome lodging house with a row of shuttered windows and a brass knocker that glimmered faintly in the lamplight. Holmes leapt lightly from the cab and rapped with the peculiar double tap I had heard him employ when he wished to summon attention without alarming. A sleepy porter, half-dressed and blinking, opened the door with evident irritation, which faded when Holmes produced his card and a sovereign in one smooth gesture. "Mr. Julian Vale?" Holmes asked, his tone neither loud nor low, but carrying the crisp authority that compels answer. "Rooms on the 2nd floor, sir. He came in about an hour ago. Rather the worse for drink, if you ask me. Still awake, I should think. There was a clatter of boots not 10 minutes past." Holmes's lip twitched with satisfaction. "Excellent. Show us no further. Dr. Watson, accompany me." We mounted the narrow stair, its carpet threadbare but clean, and halted before a door faintly ajar, through which drifted the odour of strong spirits and stale smoke. Holmes pushed it open without ceremony. Within, a young man of striking but dissipated appearance reclined upon a sofa, his cravat loosened, and a half-emptied decanter on the table before him. He started violently at our entrance, then recovered with a laugh, too forced to ring true. "Holmes, by all that's devilish. And Dr. Watson, I think. To what do I owe this midnight visitation?" Holmes closed the door softly behind us. "We have come, Mr. Vale, to ask how you employed yourself between the hours of 10 and 11 this evening. Your uncle lies dead, strangled in his own study, and yet his voice was heard after his passing. A curious circumstance, would you not agree?" Vale's flushed face turned ashen, and his fingers fumbled with the stem of his glass. "Dead? You say dead?" "Strangled?" Holmes repeated with merciless precision. "And a witness, several witnesses, heard him speak a command concerning a certain ledger of the Heron line. Tell me, Mr. Vale, are you in the habit of conversing with the departed?" The young man's eyes darted from Holmes to me and back again, as though seeking refuge. "By heaven, I had no hand in it. I swear it. Yes, we quarrelled, but I left him in health. I went to my club, the Corinthian, where I stayed until midnight. There are a dozen men who can vouch for me." Holmes moved forward, his gaze like a gimlet. "And after midnight? Where did you go?" Vale hesitated, then dropped his eyes. "Here, straight here." Holmes's hand darted suddenly to the table, lifting a scrap of paper that had lain half-concealed beneath the decanter. He held it to the light. It was a bill. An account from a small dealer in mechanical devices dated that very afternoon. Across its face was scrawled in hasty ink, "Cylinder delivered. Balance due." "Curious," murmured Holmes. "You take delivery of a phonograph cylinder the very day your uncle is found dead beside his machine, and yet you would have us believe your quarrel ended without consequence. What song was it, Mr. Vale, that you purchased? A sea chanty, perhaps? Or the last words of a man whose death would profit you handsomely?" The young man sprang up, his protest tumbling over itself. "I knew nothing of his death until this moment. Yes, I purchased a cylinder, but it was music only. Arias, nothing more. You can ask the shopkeeper, ask anyone." Holmes pocketed the paper with unhurried composure. "We shall ask. For the present, I advise you to remain at our disposal. Inspector Lestrade will see to it. Sleep lightly, Mr. Vale, for I may return before dawn." As we descended to the street once more, I could contain my impatience no longer. "Holmes, surely the case is plain. Vale quarrels with his uncle, secures a cylinder, and contrives the ghostly speech to cover his crime. Why not arrest him at once?" Holmes hailed our cab with a flick of the hand, his expression unreadable. "Because, my dear Watson, the case is not plain at all. Consider. If Vale had killed his uncle, why should he trouble to simulate a voice commanding the destruction of the ledger? He could have burned it himself in silence. Why summon witnesses to a marvel which could only draw suspicion upon him? No, Watson, there is a deeper current here. The cylinder, the fibre, the oil upon the latch, each points in a direction, but not the one our young friend believes. And where, then, does it point? I asked. Holmes's eyes gleamed as the cab lurched into motion, to the safe, to the ledger, and to the one person who most desired its annihilation. Vale is a pawn, but the hand that moved him is more subtle. Let us visit the dealer in cylinders at dawn. Until then, Watson, patience. The dead man spoke, but we must learn who placed the words upon his lips. The pale light of morning had scarcely begun to touch the mist that clung to the strand, when Holmes roused me from a half-doze in my chair, for we had returned but briefly to Baker Street to warm ourselves and review the night's proceedings. He was already dressed with that brisk efficiency which bespoke a mind in full motion. "Come, Watson," he said, thrusting a cup of coffee into my hand. "Our next witness is not a man to keep waiting. The dealer in cylinders opens early, for his patrons are gentlemen of leisure who rise late, and he must have his wares ready to tempt them. We took a hansom across the river of carts and carriages beginning their day, and presently drew up before a narrow shop in Charing Cross Road, whose window displayed the polished horns and delicate machinery of the Edison phonograph. Within, the air smelled faintly of oil and resin, and behind the counter a spectacled man of small stature was arranging a row of wax cylinders, each in its pasteboard case. He looked up sharply as Holmes entered, and a flicker of recognition, or was it apprehension, crossed his face. "Good morning," Holmes said pleasantly, leaning upon his stick. "We come upon an errand of some consequence. You supplied, yesterday afternoon, a cylinder to Mr. Julian Vale of Jermyn Street. You will oblige me by stating the nature of that article." The man hesitated, glanced at me, then back at Holmes. "Why, sir, a musical recording as requested, an Italian aria. I keep records of my transactions, if you will allow me." He bent to a ledger beneath the counter, but Holmes's hand shot out and pressed it shut. "Your caution does you credit, Mr. Jarvis, for that is your name, I think. But you have already betrayed yourself. The scrap of paper we found in Vale's rooms bore your handwriting, did it not? Cylinder delivered, balance due. And yet you say the article was musical. Tell me, have you ever inscribed such a note for a common opera recording?" Jarvis coloured deeply. The young gentleman pressed me for haste. He wished a private commission. "I record voices as well as music, sir. It is legal enough." He brought me a sheet of words, asked me to read them into the machine with a certain inflection, and paid handsomely for my trouble. "Indeed," said Holmes softly. "What words?" The man's discomfort was plain. I cannot recall precisely. Something about burning a book, a ledger. It seemed nonsense to me, but the gentleman was insistent. I read as directed, and he took the cylinder away at once. Holmes's eyes shone. So, the dead man's voice was not dead at all, but the counterfeit of this honest fellow's throat. And yet, why would Vale procure such a device, then allow it to betray him by sounding at the exact moment of discovery? No, Jarvis, there is more. Did the young gentleman collect the cylinder himself? Jarvis looked startled. "Why, no. I was prevented from leaving the shop, so I sent a boy with it to Jermyn Street. He delivered it into the hands of a tall servant, as he said. A man with a scar across his cheek. That is all I know." Holmes clapped the counter with sudden satisfaction. "Excellent. We shall find our phantom yet. A servant with a scar. Watson, recall that neither the butler nor footman at Queen Anne's Gate bore such a mark. Therefore, an intruder in the household, under guise of service, conveyed the cylinder into the very heart of Penrith's study. Vale may have been used as a shield, his name covering the trail. We left the shop at once, Holmes striding with unusual animation, his coat flying behind him in the brisk morning air. "Watson, the noose tightens." The voice was planted, the cylinder crushed, the ledger destroyed. Our task is to find who profits by its absence. Not Vale alone, though his folly has entangled him. Someone of greater cunning stands behind. But who? I asked as we turned back toward Westminster. Patience, my dear fellow. Let us return to the Penrith house. I wish to see the servants in full daylight. A scar upon the cheek is not easily disguised, and when I find it, we shall be one step nearer to hearing the truth, not of the dead, but of the living. The household at Queen Anne's Gate was stirring when we returned, the air heavy with the solemn quiet of a house where death had entered. The blinds were drawn low, and the servants moved with subdued tread, their faces drawn with anxiety. Lestrade, who had evidently spent the remainder of the night in ceaseless activity, met us in the hall with a mixture of relief and irritation. "You are back, Mr. Holmes. I've had each servant questioned separately, but nothing of moment has turned up. The butler swears the doors were fastened, the footman confirms it, and the housekeeper insists no stranger passed the threshold yesterday. We are no further advanced than we were." "On the contrary," Holmes returned, his eyes darting quickly about the group of domestics assembled at the foot of the staircase. "We are precisely at the point where advance is possible. Line them up, if you please. I wish to look upon each in turn." There were 5 in all. The butler, a portly man with a florid face. The footman, tall and nervous, his gaze fixed on the floor. The housekeeper, thin-lipped and watchful. A maidservant whose red eyes betrayed recent tears. And a stout cook still wearing her apron. Holmes passed before them like a commander inspecting troops, his gaze cool, precise, and utterly without pity. He paused only briefly at the footman, whose hands trembled slightly as Holmes's glance fixed upon him. "You, sir," Holmes said suddenly, his voice cutting through the silence. "Have you ever served elsewhere in London?" The man stammered. "Yes, sir. A year at a house in Mayfair." "And before that?" Holmes pressed, his tone sharpening. The footman swallowed hard. "With the Heron Line offices, sir. Messenger duties. I left of my own accord." Holmes's gaze fell upon the left side of the man's face, and with the swiftness of a hawk, he reached forward, brushing aside a lock of hair that had been artfully arranged. A pale scar curved across the cheekbone, unmistakable in the daylight. The man recoiled with a muffled curse, his hand flying to conceal it. "There is our courier, Lestrade," Holmes declared. The boy from Jarvis's shop placed the cylinder in these hands, not in Mr. Vale's. And it was this same man who contrived to place it in Penrith's study and set the machine in motion at the appointed hour. "Arrest him!" The servants cried out in shock, while Lestrade sprang forward and clapped a hand on the fellow's shoulder. The man, seeing resistance was useless, dropped his head in sullen silence. Holmes, however, was not content with capture alone. "Your name?" he demanded. "Cray," the footman muttered. "Thomas Cray." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Cray of the Heron Line, dismissed for dishonesty. I know the type. You were engaged here under false references, and you used your place to destroy what your former masters most feared. Proof of their frauds. The Green Ledger contained records of irregular shipments, false accounts, matters that would ruin powerful men. Penrith, though retired, had preserved it. He died for his stubbornness." Miss Penrith, who had descended in agitation upon hearing the commotion, gasped and steadied herself against the banister. "You mean, my uncle was murdered not for quarrels of family, but for the secrets of his company?" Holmes inclined his head gravely. "It is so. But though Cray is caught, We have not yet plucked out the root. He is an instrument only. The hand that guided him lies elsewhere. And it is toward that hidden master we must now turn our search. For the voice that spoke after death was but the first whisper of a greater conspiracy. Cray was led away protesting his innocence, though the manner of it was half-hearted, as though he himself had long resigned to the inevitability of exposure. Lestrade, flushed with the satisfaction of a tangible arrest, turned upon Holmes. Well, there you have him, the man with the scar, caught red-handed in the house itself. That ought to be enough for any court in the land. Holmes's smile was as thin as a knife-blade. Enough for a court, perhaps, but not for truth. You mistake the tool for the craftsman, Inspector. Cray is but a messenger, one who handled the cylinder and saw to its delivery at the critical moment. Yet he could not have profited by the ledger's destruction, nor commanded the intricate arrangement by which Penrith's voice was made to echo beyond the grave. Lestrade frowned. Then you think someone higher up? Someone from the Heron line, perhaps? Undoubtedly. The line is rotten in its upper decks, Watson, not in its stokehold. A servant does not dare risk his neck for such a venture unless promised protection by men whose influence can sway a jury or silence a witness. The question before us is, which of Penrith's former partners had most to lose by that ledger's preservation? Miss Penrith, who had been listening intently, spoke with sudden fervour. There is one, Mr. Holmes, Mr. Henry Carbery. He was my uncle's closest associate in the Heron line. But of late they were bitter enemies. I have heard my uncle call him unscrupulous, even dangerous. Yet he still sought my uncle's company, writing him letters that were always burned after reading. Holmes's eyes lit with a quiet fire. Ah, Carbery, a name that sails well in mercantile circles, but perhaps one to be feared in darker waters. Tell me, Miss Penrith, was he expected at the house? She hesitated. I do not know. My uncle kept his business affairs from me. But 2 evenings ago he received a note that left him agitated. He locked himself in the study for hours afterward. Holmes drew from his pocket the crumb of wax and the green fibre he had earlier collected. Then Carbery shall be the next link in our chain. The ledger is gone, but ash and fibre tell a tale even fire cannot wholly silence. Lestrade, keep your man under lock and key. We shall call upon Mr. Carbery without delay. Within the hour we were once more in our cab, the fog lifting to reveal a city already humming with the day's commerce. Holmes sat alert, his profile sharp against the pale light. Watson, he said, consider the elegance of the design. A quarrel between uncle and nephew provides the perfect screen. A cylinder supplies the impossible voice, and a loyal servant becomes the hand of execution. Behind it all lies a mind that understands not only fraud in accounts, but fraud in perception. That is the man we seek. And if Carbery is indeed that man, I asked, then, my dear fellow, we shall see whether the living may be compelled to speak as unwillingly as the dead. The residence of Henry Carbery stood in Portland Place, a grand edifice of stone whose austere facade betrayed little of the man within. When we arrived, the footman admitted us with a smoothness that suggested our visit had been expected. Carbery himself awaited us in a drawing-room of severe elegance. A tall, spare figure with iron-grey hair brushed back from a forehead that seemed carved for calculation. His gaze, when it fell upon Holmes, was steady, cool, and faintly amused. Mr. Sherlock Holmes, he said in a voice as polished as the mahogany about us. And Dr. Watson, of course. I had anticipated this call. My late associate Penrith was a man of peculiar habits, and his sudden death would inevitably attract your peculiar talents. Holmes bowed slightly, his eyes never leaving the other's face. "It is gratifying to be so well known. You are correct. We investigate the death of Mr. Penrith and the strange sequel of his posthumous utterance. Perhaps you can enlighten us as to why a ledger of the Heron line, long thought a matter of routine accountancy, should warrant destruction in the very moment after his demise." Carberry's lips curved in a smile that did not touch his eyes. "Ledger? I fear you overrate the importance of dusty books, Mr. Holmes. My late colleague was a man inclined to dramatics. If he fancied that his papers concealed conspiracies, it was the indulgence of an aging mind. I assure you, the Heron line conducts itself with utmost respectability." Holmes sank into a chair, folding his long fingers together, and regarded the man as a naturalist might a rare insect. "And yet, Carberry, you maintained correspondence with him until the very end. Letters were burned, but not without leaving their smoke. Your concern was not imaginary." For the first time, a flicker of unease crossed the man's features. He masked it quickly, pouring himself a glass of claret from the decanter at his elbow. Business differences, nothing more. Old Penrith could be obstinate. He clung to certain methods long abandoned by modern commerce. Holmes's tone sharpened. "He clung, sir, not to methods but to truth. He kept a ledger which spoke with more authority than any voice, living or dead. That ledger is gone, burned before witnesses. A servant of your former company, placed within his household under false pretences, has confessed to the part he played. Tell me, Mr. Carberry, are you so certain the flames have consumed all that might incriminate?" Carberry's hand paused midway to his lips. The colour drained subtly from his cheeks, and though he forced a laugh, it rang hollow in the vast room. "You come dangerously near to accusation, Mr. Holmes. I warn you, my reputation is not to be trifled with." Holmes rose, and his eyes flashed with sudden intensity. "Reputations, like ledgers, are but paper when fire is applied. I have but one more question. Where were you at 11 last night?" The silence stretched a heartbeat too long before Carberry answered. "At my club, the Criterion. You may inquire if you doubt me." Holmes inclined his head with deceptive mildness. "Rest assured I shall, and if your alibi proves less sound than the varnish of your furniture, I shall return with Lestrade at my side." As we took our leave, I saw a bead of moisture glisten upon Carberry's brow, though the room was cool. Once in the street, I turned to Holmes. "You believe him guilty, then?" Holmes's eyes were bright with that fierce light I knew so well. "Guilty, Watson, yes, but not yet ensnared. He has laid his plans with skill, but he cannot erase every trace. Tonight he may still make a move to cover what remains. We must be ready, for the game is entering its final act." The cab rattled us back toward Baker Street, the chill evening air finding its way through every seam and rattling pane. Holmes was silent for much of the journey, his eyes half closed, yet gleaming with the restless activity of his thoughts. At last he spoke, so softly that I leaned forward to catch his words. "Carberry lies, Watson. His manner betrayed him, but manner alone is insufficient. We must tie him to the mechanism of the crime, and that will demand patience." "You think he will make another move?" I asked. "Undoubtedly. He is a man accustomed to command, and the ledger, though reduced to ash, may not have been the only fragment of danger. Men like Carberry fear paper trails as much as daggers. If he suspects that Penrith entrusted any copy, note, or memorandum to another, he will not rest until it is destroyed. That, Watson, is where we must set our snare." We had scarcely alighted at Baker Street when Lestrade arrived in a state of eager bustle, his coat powdered with dust and his expression triumphant. "I've checked Carberry's story," he announced, dropping heavily into a chair. "Criterion Club confirms he dined there last night from 9 till near midnight. A score of gentlemen saw him, so his alibi holds tight. You'll have to look elsewhere, Mr. Holmes." Holmes regarded him with a mixture of amusement and impatience. "Alas, Inspector, you mistake visibility for innocence. An alibi that shines too brightly often conceals the darkest shadow. What better cover than a crowded club, where a man may appear punctually, yet his hand has already moved the pieces into place elsewhere?" Lestrade frowned, unconvinced, but Holmes had already turned to me. "Watson, do you recall Miss Penrith's remark concerning a note received 2 nights past? If Carberry wrote it, it may yet linger among his discarded papers. I shall visit his offices tonight, with or without invitation. Would you care to accompany me?" I agreed at once, though not without a stirring of unease at the thought of a nocturnal intrusion. Yet when, near midnight, we found ourselves slipping down the narrow alley beside the Heron Line's offices, I could not deny the thrill of the chase. Holmes produced a small instrument from his pocket, and within moments the lock yielded to his skill. We stepped into a corridor that smelled of ink and dust, the hush broken only by the distant tick of a clock. Holmes's lantern cast a thin beam as he led the way into a private chamber at the rear, clearly Carberry's own. Papers were stacked with military precision upon the desk. Ledgers ranged like soldiers on the shelves. Holmes moved with a surety that suggested he had already divined where the secret lay. At the back of the desk drawer he found a packet of letters, tied with string. He unfolded one, and the neat, bold hand within made his eyes glitter. "Watson, observe. If the old fool persists, we must silence him before he ruins all. Cray is reliable. The ledger must be ash before the week is out. Signed, H.C. Could there be plainer evidence?" Before I could answer, a faint sound in the corridor made Holmes extinguish the lantern and draw me into the shadows. The door opened stealthily, and a tall figure slipped inside. In the pale wash of moonlight from the window, the iron-grey head of Henry Carberry was unmistakable. He moved swiftly to the desk, opened the very drawer Holmes had rifled, and froze at the sight of the missing bundle. Holmes's hand touched my arm like steel. "Now, Watson," he whispered, "the trap is sprung. The man who would burn the truth has just discovered it can burn him instead." Carberry stiffened as though struck, his hand lingering above the empty drawer. A muttered oath escaped him, low but fierce, and he turned sharply toward the window, his profile etched in silver against the night. Holmes, moving with the noiseless swiftness of a cat, stepped forward into the beam of moonlight. "You search for something, Mr. Carberry," he said, his tone calm, almost conversational. Carberry spun round, the mask of composure shattered for the first time. "Holmes," he hissed, "you hear?" His hand darted instinctively toward his coat, but Holmes's long arm shot out and caught his wrist before it could close upon the revolver half hidden in the pocket. "Come, sir," Holmes said icily. "Violence is but a poor refuge for the guilty. You have already armed yourself with deception enough. Carberry wrenched free, but his bravado faltered. He leaned heavily against the desk, his breath harsh. "You do not understand. The ledger was dangerous to many, not only myself. Penrith would have ruined us all with his obstinacy. He had to be silenced." "You confess, then?" Holmes murmured, eyes glittering. "I confess nothing," Carberry snapped, regaining a trace of his old authority. "Your word against mine, and I have the standing of a gentleman. You cannot prove I laid hand upon him." Holmes's lips curved into a cold smile. "Not by hand, perhaps. You were clever enough to employ Cray for the cylinder and the final service. But you overlooked one thing." He reached into his pocket and withdrew the green fibre, holding it delicately between thumb and forefinger. "This, sir, was torn from your cuff as you bent over the grate to scatter the ashes. A trifle, yet in trifles lie the great truths. Carberry's eyes widened, and for a moment I thought he would lunge at Holmes. Instead he sagged, his shoulders bowing under the weight of exposure. "So it is to end thus," he muttered. "Not quite," Holmes said, his voice low but resonant. "You will end it in Lestrade's custody. The law will have its say. But more than law, Carberry, you have underestimated reason. A dead man's voice may deceive the ears of many, yet it cannot deceive the logic of one who listens beyond sound." The sudden flare of a lantern in the doorway revealed Lestrade himself, whom Holmes had contrived to summon earlier, with a discreet note. 2 constables stood at his back. Carberry started like a trapped beast, but the inspector was upon him in an instant, clapping iron cuffs on his wrists. Holmes straightened, his gaze never leaving the prisoner. "You see, Watson," he said quietly, as Carberry was led away. "The voice after death was but a phantom conjured by mortal cunning. Yet, in the end, truth speaks louder than any cylinder." We stepped out into the cool air, the first stirrings of dawn creeping along the horizon. Holmes drew his coat close about him, his face softened by a weariness that only I, who knew him best, could read. "Another case concluded, Watson, and another reminder that while men may contrive to make the dead speak, they can never silence the living conscience of fact." We returned to Baker Street that morning, with the city fully awake around us, its ceaseless tide of carts, costermongers, and hansoms indifferent to the ruin of one of its great merchants. Holmes sank into his chair with a languid sigh, drawing the violin to his shoulder, as though the strains of music were needed to balance the turbulence of human intrigue. I, for my part, was eager to set down the extraordinary events of the night, yet questions still pressed upon me. "Holmes," I said, "there is one point that troubles me still. Carberry may be guilty of conspiracy, but what of the strangulation itself? You have shown how the cylinder contrived the illusion of Penrith's voice, and how Cray was used as a pawn. But who placed hands upon the old man's throat?" Holmes lowered the violin and regarded me with a half-smile. "Ah, Watson, always the practical surgeon. The answer lies in what we already know. Penrith was strong in spirit but frail in body. His assailant did not need great force. Cray, placed in the house, had both opportunity and instruction. It was he who performed the deed, clumsy in execution, but sufficient. Carberry's genius lay not in the act of murder, but in disguising its purpose. The cylinder, the locked door, the apparent miracle, these were his strokes, designed to throw police and family alike upon a false trail. Without them, the crime would have been brutish and transparent. I reflected upon this, and the chain of reasoning fell into place with admirable clarity. Still, I ventured another doubt. And the ledger, are we certain it is lost beyond recall? If it alone contained the proof, what remains to convict Carberry? Holmes set down his instrument and reached for the small tin in which he kept his clippings and fragments from the case. He held aloft the green fibre and the wax crumb. These, Watson, coupled with the letter I recovered from his desk, suffice. The fibre matches his coat. The crumb proves the use of the cylinder, and the letter is the nail in the coffin. With such evidence, no jury will doubt the scheme. Lestrade may strut with the arrest, but the gallows will owe its service to deduction. At that moment a knock came upon the door, and Miss Lydia Penrith was shown in. She was pale from sleeplessness, but there was a resolute calm about her. "Mr. Holmes," she said softly, "I have heard that Mr. Carberry is taken. I wished only to thank you, for myself and for my uncle's memory. He was not mad, as some would have whispered. He guarded truth, and you have avenged him." Holmes rose and inclined his head gravely. "Your uncle was a man of honour, Miss Penrith. His enemies sought to smother his voice, but in the end it was their own that betrayed them. Take comfort that his steadfastness, not their cunning, will endure." She clasped his hand with quiet gratitude and withdrew. For some time after she had gone, Holmes stood at the window, gazing into the bustling street below. "Watson," he said at last, "men may twist words, destroy papers, even mimic the voices of the dead. But there is always some trace left, some fibre, some ash, some fracture in the mask. It is the task of reason to find it. When reason speaks, it is the living world itself that testifies, and no trick of phonograph or phantom can silence it." With that, he turned back to his violin, and as the notes rose soft and clear, I felt once more that peculiar mixture of awe and affection which my friend unfailingly inspired. Another case was closed, yet already I knew he looked beyond it, to the next riddle waiting in the fog of London's endless night. Several days had passed since the arrest, and the newspapers were filled with little else. Carberry's name, once synonymous with prosperity and probity, now blazed across every column, a byword for deceit and avarice. Lestrade, flushed with success, had granted statements to the press in which his own diligence featured prominently, though Holmes's part was mentioned only in passing, and then with grudging brevity. I confess I was nettled on my friend's behalf, yet Holmes himself seemed untroubled. "My dear Watson," he said one evening, as he cut the reports from the Times and laid them carefully in his scrapbook, "public applause is the inspector's oxygen. Let him breathe deep. For myself, the quiet satisfaction of precision attained is enough. You at least record the truth in your notes, and that will suffice for posterity." I was about to protest when Mrs. Hudson entered with a card upon a tray. Holmes glanced at it, his brows lifting slightly. "Dr. Percival Gale," he remarked, "our medical witness returns. Show him in." "Show him in." The doctor appeared, more haggard than when we had last seen him. He wasted little time upon greetings, but seated himself with nervous energy. "Mr. Holmes, I cannot quiet my conscience. You must hear me out. Since Penrith's death, I have been haunted by doubts. At the time, I was certain he was beyond life. Yet now, recalling the colour of the lips, the faint warmth of the skin, I wonder whether the strangulation had been complete. Suppose there was still a flicker, a final breath, when the voice was heard. Suppose he truly spoke. I started, but Holmes merely regarded him with grave intensity. "Your scruple does you credit, Doctor, but your science misleads you. The words were too measured, too deliberate, to be the gasping utterance of a man at death's edge. Moreover, they matched precisely the lines Jarvis was instructed to record. No, Penrith's silence was final. Carberry built his artifice upon your professional certainty, gambling that you would swear to death, and thus lend weight to the impossibility. That you now doubt yourself is proof only of your honesty." Gale covered his face with his hands. "Then I was but a pawn." "Precisely," Holmes answered, "as was Cray, and as was Vale. Carberry's genius lay in arranging each piece so that it obscured the others. Yet even genius leaves a thread untucked, a fibre upon a latch, a phrase too apt to be accidental." The doctor rose, somewhat comforted, and departed. When the door closed, Holmes turned to me with a glimmer of irony. "There, Watson, you see the danger of half-knowledge. A man of science without imagination becomes the best ally of deceit. He is convinced by what seems impossible, while the impossible is often only improbable, awaiting explanation." He relit his pipe and sank back into the sofa, the smoke curling about his features like a veil. I watched him in silence, struck anew by the curious union in him of cold reason and restless spirit. Outside, London's roar swelled and ebbed, heedless of the truth that had been wrested from its shadows. Yet within those rooms at Baker Street, it seemed to me the world had narrowed to a single figure, lean, austere, and indomitable, who alone could compel the dead to surrender their borrowed voices and restore them to the realm of fact. The trial of Henry Carbery was set with unusual swiftness, for the Crown recognized the weight of public outrage and the necessity of decisive justice. In the intervening days, Holmes remained outwardly tranquil, but I observed in him a peculiar restlessness, as though some chord in the case had not yet ceased vibrating. He would pace before the fire at odd hours, pause to finger the green fibre in his little tin, or draw from his pocket the letter he had taken from Carbery's desk, studying it anew as if it might yield some further secret. One evening, when I ventured to remark that all was surely concluded and Carbery's fate sealed, Holmes shook his head with that faint, sardonic smile which told me he had travelled further in thought than I. "Concluded? No, Watson, only resolved in part. The hand has been seized, but what of the arm that guided it? Consider, Carbery was ruthless, but even ruthlessness has limits. To plant a servant in Penrith's house months in advance, to acquire a cylinder through an unwitting client, to orchestrate an alibi at his club. Such precision smacks of an intelligence broader than his own. He played his part, yes, but I question whether he was the composer of the entire symphony. The suggestion startled me. You believe another stands behind him? Possibly, Holmes said, his eyes narrowing. It may be no more than the ghost of suspicion, but I cannot silence it. Carbery's letters spoke of us, of partners imperilled, and yet only he sits in the dock. Where are the others? Silent in fear or hidden in complicity? Until I know, I cannot rest easy. The matter soon pressed itself further upon us, for on the very next morning Lestrade arrived with troubling news. Carbery has kept a stubborn silence, he reported, but this dawn his solicitor entered a plea that he was but an agent acting under instructions. The court will not hear it, for the evidence against him is plain, yet he swears he will not hang alone. Holmes's eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of one whose instincts are confirmed. As I suspected, there is another player upon the board, and Carbery, for all his arrogance, was but a knight moved in service of a hidden king. Mark me, Watson. Before the noose tightens, he will attempt some revelation, whether to save himself or to drag down his confederates in revenge. We must be present when he speaks, for it may alter the very course of justice. Thus it was that the affair, which I had thought concluded, assumed once more that taut expectancy which is the very air my friend breathes. For Holmes the puzzle was never merely in the crime itself, but in the unseen hand behind it, the architecture of deception that stretched beyond the reach of common sight. And as he leaned forward in his chair, pipe smoke wreathing about him, I knew with a certainty that chilled me that the case of the gentleman who spoke after death had not yet spoken its final word. The Old Bailey was thronged when the day of trial arrived. Every bench was filled, the press gallery packed with eager scribes, and the public craning forward as though to drink in every word of the drama. Carbery entered the dock with the composure of a man who had long trained his features to betray nothing. His iron-grey head was held high, but there was in the set of his jaw a bitterness that betrayed his awareness of the net closing about him. Holmes and I secured places near the front, and I confess I felt the same nervous anticipation as when we had first stepped into Penrith's shuttered study. The prosecution laid out its case with ruthless clarity. Creye's confession, the damning letter from Carberry's desk, the green fibre, the phantom voice, all were marshalled in order, until even the most sceptical juror could hardly doubt the chain of guilt. Carberry listened in silence, only once allowing himself a cold smile when the phonograph cylinder was mentioned, as if amused by the very ingenuity that now condemned him. When at last his counsel rose, the court hushed to a deeper stillness. The defence was brief, almost perfunctory, and then Carberry himself demanded leave to address the court. His voice, when it came, rang with startling force. Yes, I stand accused, and yes, I admit my part. But know this, I was not alone. Penrith's death was decreed by more than one hand. There are names, men you would know, whose fortunes stand upon the ashes of that ledger. They feared him more than I did. They compelled me, pressed me, and when I faltered, they gave me Creye. Shall I speak their names? A murmur surged through the hall, silenced only by the judge's stern gavel. All eyes turned to Carberry, who stood in the dock as though balanced on the edge of revelation. I glanced at Holmes and saw the keen expectancy in his face, the hawk-like poise of a mind ready to seize upon the smallest word. But at that very instant Carberry faltered, his hand clutching at his breast. His face blanched, his body stiffened, and he collapsed heavily against the rail. A cry went up. The doctor attached to the court rushed forward, but even before his verdict I knew what had occurred. Poison, swift and merciless, had silenced the man at the very threshold of disclosure. Holmes rose swiftly, his voice cutting through the tumult. "Search his person! The poison was not of his choosing. It has been administered to still his tongue." The court dissolved into confusion, officers pressing about the fallen prisoner, spectators surging to their feet, and amid the uproar, Holmes's eyes swept the chamber, darting from face to face with predatory intensity. I knew in that moment he was not watching Carberry at all, but the crowd, seeking the faintest tremor of guilt in some hidden confederate who had chosen to murder silence rather than permit the truth to speak. Now, generate the final section of the story, ensuring a satisfying resolution. Maintain the logical progression of clues and character arcs, delivering the final reveal smoothly, while keeping the ending impactful and true to the detective's style. The uproar within the courtroom was not easily calmed, yet Holmes, with a gesture of quiet authority, secured a moment's stillness. Carberry's body had been borne away, the physician declaring death instantaneous. A vial, scarcely larger than a thimble, had been found secreted in his waistcoat, but Holmes dismissed it with a wave of the hand. "A plant," he said in a voice low but distinct, "placed where it must be discovered, so the world may believe Carberry silenced himself. But the hand that guided his ruin still moves, Watson, and it moves among us." I followed his gaze as it swept across the court, past jurors and clerks, past the curious crowd, until it fixed at last upon the gallery, where the merchants of the city had gathered in sombre attendance. Among them I noticed a face grown suddenly pale, the broad, square-jawed figure of Sir Alton Devereux, chairman of the Heron Lines Board. He met Holmes's stare for an instant, then shifted uneasily, his eyes falling. Holmes leaned close to me. There, Watson, the true composer. Carberry's skill was but the instrument. Devereux wrote the score. Only one in his position could profit by Penrith's silence and command the resources to carry out the masquerade. He feared Carberry's desperation, and when the man threatened exposure, he struck first. Events moved swiftly thereafter. Holmes requested that Lestrade keep Devereux under discreet guard, while he himself laid before the Crown the packet of letters recovered from Carberry's office. Among them, overlooked until now, was a single sheet in a different hand. Devereux's unmistakable signature at its base, urging swift removal of the ledger that endangers us all. With this final piece, the case was closed beyond doubt. Devereux was seized before nightfall, protesting his innocence with the dignity of a man too accustomed to power to admit its end. It was some days later, as we sat once more in our Baker Street rooms, that Holmes spoke of it with that mixture of irony and weariness I had come to recognize as the aftermath of triumph. You see, Watson, how the voice of the dead was contrived not only to deceive, but to distract. While all eyes stared in awe at a phantom, the true villain moved unobserved. Carberry was brilliant in execution, but Devereux was the strategist. He played with men as though with counters upon a board, only he forgot that the smallest fragment, a fibre, a crumb of wax, may turn the whole board against him. I could not help but reflect upon Miss Penrith, whose composure had never faltered. She had borne the scandal with quiet strength, and when told of Devereux's arrest, she had murmured only, "Then my uncle's honour is safe." Holmes, hearing this, had inclined his head in rare solemnity. His honour, yes, for though they burned his words, they could not burn his truth. As the evening shadows lengthened, Holmes drew his violin from its case, setting bow to string with a contemplative air. The dead spoke, Watson, yet it was the living who betrayed themselves. Remember that. Men may forge voices and destroy ledgers, but in their haste they always leave behind some whisper of the truth, and it is to that whisper the detective must listen, when all others hear only silence. The notes rose, soft and searching, while beyond the window London's fog rolled in once more, veiling its secrets, and I as ever marvelled at the friend who could draw music from strings and truth from shadows, restoring order to a world ever eager to conceal its crimes beneath the clamour of deceit. Thus ended the case of the gentleman who spoke after death, a tale of fraud, cunning, and retribution, with Holmes once more the instrument by which justice found its voice.